summer 2026 Ethics and Diversity for Athletic Coaches. As a group, we've decided to do Heart of Gold, and um, basically as a group discussion. So really how institutional failure enables the abuse of young gymnasts, and looking at through a lens of ethical responsibility, power and abuse in sport, organizational culture, athlete welfare, safeguarding, and using various reporting mechanisms, or how these reporting mechanisms may or may not have worked in this particular case with Michigan State University and USAG. So our panel of experts on this are myself, I'll be the moderator, Fred Downey. We've got Sam Monks, who's going to be going over the ethical responsibilities component. Nestor Rodriguez, over the power and abuse component. Caleb Congo with reporting and mechanisms. Adam Ryan on the organizational culture. And then I will wrap up with athlete welfare and safeguarding. And then we'll have like a conclusion component. So the analytical lens, why does this matter? All right. And our lens on this project, on this podcast, will be through a kind of multiple frameworks. Part of it's going to be Cunningham's organizational and institutional studies framework, and how that relates to potentially how the organizations failed within their duties to the athletes and various stakeholders. How the structure and culture of these organizations, whether it be USAG, Michigan State University, or even the two gyms that were involved, whether it be Florida Ranch or Twistars, how their structure and culture and how shapes the conduct that was going on. Treating, how are we treating the failures, a systematic failure of the institution, or, I don't think that it was just any one individual's wrongdoing. Certainly, some of it was one individual's wrongdoing, but then there's the institutional cascade throughout that. And then, what are some of the key accountabilities, and then ethical theories, duty of care, or consequentialism with our outcomes, or other components. And then, why it matters to the stakeholders, whether it be athletes, coaches, parents, administrators, organizations, fans, community, and that component. And then, kind of continuing with that, the implications for coaching and practice and sports leadership. How did this a Heart of Gold video kind of inform that, and what were the implications as we're looking at through the lens of the course, the ethics course that we're taking, and perhaps how did it change your approach on how you would coach or manage or so forth. So, I've got a couple more slides, but I'm just going to kind of go back to kind of the beginning, and I'm going to ask Sam from his perspective. Sam, what did you feel? And guys, feel free to chime in. Sam, what do you feel with respect to the ethical responsibilities of the organizations or individuals that enabled Larry Nassar to, sexually abuse over 300 athletes?
Yeah, thank you, Fred, for the first question. There's a lot to dive in on this. When you look at the constant, I would call it like constant trends of what we watched, me and my fellow colleagues here, we watched and observed a lot of different types of behaviours that were, especially from Dr. Larry Nassar, which was involving a lot of private one-to-one contact with athletes that had just a sense that there was a lot of like shielding away from other like watching adults. I think that the main pieces of ethical concerns that I saw, which was going on throughout the whole documentary, was just the fact that, first of all, I didn't see anything recorded from anything that was going on with like let's go with massages, right? Or if we're looking at protocols of parents being involved in the room physically with the athlete, were there regular checks going on with what was being recorded? What were, monthly check-ins, weekly check-ins on what sort of techniques were being used around the athlete's body? Obviously, Dr. Larry Nassar had a lot of contact with young female athletes at his disposal. So not even having someone else within the rooms that he was in caused concern. I think we could all agree that having a basement to conduct private one-to-ones is a big, big ethical issue in itself. Like, the liability is huge, and to allow that to go on over a very long period of time, a sustained period of time, without really there being, from what I could recall on the documentary, anyone checking in and doing some regulatory checks, whether it's through the state or whether it was through other organisations that on a more national scale that Dr. Nasser was involved with. So from an ethical standpoint, that was the biggest concern. Just watching and seeing that, and I'm thinking, well, if he's not been like asked to like submit his work on a video or even give access to, so I don't recall him even giving the parents video access to some of these techniques that he was using. I think that caused a lot of concerns. Obviously, throughout the whole documentary, we saw other individuals come into more of the focus with the Kathy Clegis coming in and Steve Penny, the US Olympics. And I just think when you look at the system is very broke, right? That's just obvious. And I wanted to quote from one of the references I found in one of the papers that was very much alluding to the organisations that we watched and their conduct and sort of their policies. So the aim of dilemma training is to recognise that difficult dilemma type situations are inevitable in organisations. To send the message as an organisation to their members that they are not alone, that when they face dilemmas, and to provide them with safe techniques and advice on how to deal with situations. That was from a Dr. Harvey and Richard Light uh, paper that I found based in 1982 all the way up to 2012. And I just think, just as I come more out of the descriptions, you look at, I know, Fred, you mentioned briefly about the locate, right, the physical locations, not just the rooms that these people were working in, but also like the on-site methods that they would use in these random locations that could have very poor cell service, very limited contact with other adults, and it just had a very, very poor conduct and just feel surrounding a lot of what was going on.
Something I like to add there. So when they I saw like some of the victims talked about the conduct that was taking place, like with their parents in there, and they're like, "Oh, it must be okay if my parents in here." But I just wonder how much like could they not see like what their parents were doing, like that was like a burning question the entire time I was watching. I was like, the parents in there, was he actually doing anything or was he not, and like to what extent, and like that would be like a good question just to kind of clear up like why a parent would be okay with someone doing continuously work and stuff with them and stuff like that. I felt like if I ever saw something that was inappropriate, I mean, that's an easy way just to pull them out. But I mean, you know, I question, I don't know, like you said, there's not a lot of film where it shows maybe they were covered and he was doing inappropriate things, or if like he just like basically gained their trust and did like the routine stuff. And then once he knew that he could take them, anywhere, then it was kind of like, oh, well, now I can do whatever I want, sort of thing. I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, Caleb, I think that's a really good point. What I had seen it was actually an article from DePaul University, Journal of Sports Law, that he would not often, but sometimes he would bring in parents, but then he would place his body between where the parents were at and where the child was at, and then do his thing, his unethical thing. And one parent in particular had asked a question, and he just used his authority as being like an expert in this field, and that was enough to kind of dissuade the parent of thinking that there was anything inappropriate. So, using that authority and abusing that authority, was one of his aims and means that allowed this to perpetuate for as long as it did. And Sam, kind of taking it to the point that in terms of institutional letdown, I think that there is a lot of institutional letdowns. You had the International Olympic Committee, which the U.S. was part of, had some very very specific protocols. This was in Mountjoy's article, Safeguarding the Child Athlete in Sport. I'm just going to quote the Olympic Movement Medical Code 2009, which underscores that all stakeholders should take care that sport is practiced without danger to health of the athletes with respect to fair play and sports ethics. And it continues on to say, measures necessary to protect health of participants and to minimize the risk of physical and psychological harm. So there was, going back at least to 2009, before this was reported, that there was a framework of which USAG and the United States Olympic Committee would have been under the IIOC's, guidance, and that was completely broken down. And so you have this culture of not only the physical abuse but emotional abuse from both gyms and at Michigan State University as well. You had the physical abuse going on, obviously all being perpetuated by the same individual, but you had multiple institutions that just basically turned a blind eye in in spite of having, in theory, safeguards for the athletes. They had all these different stakeholders that were dropping the ball. Nestor or Adam, feel free to chime in on this component.
One thing I think we could add here about this is you have to understand like the culture of USA gymnastics. After the Karolyis defected from Romania and the Soviet bloc to the USA, they had a very kind of like abusive way of dealing with the athletes, and this became the culture of USA gymnastics because then they were putting winning above the welfare of the athletes. They also started using younger athletes on purpose for like a reason that they could be able to control. And this allowed Larry Nassar to kind of work within that culture to, perpetuate this like sexual abuse. To kind of explain it through Foucault's theory of like biopower. If you've ever heard of that, I'll just read a little bit from, although this paper was about athlete A, it's discussing the same thing that was in this documentary as well. Basically, Foucault's form of biopower does not exist through violent force, but through the desires it creates. And so the culture was built around the athlete's desire to become Olympic athletes. And so at that young age, they're willing to do whatever it takes. So they're more willing to accept bad behavior and bad treatment. And so even when you're talking about, like Caleb mentioned, how is Larry Nassar performing, these kind of things when the parents are in the room, sometimes they could have just thought maybe this is like what we have to do to become like Olympic athletes. And so it's like the culture was like perpetuating and like kind of allowing this to happen in a way.
Yeah, great point.
Yeah.
That's a great point.
I'll just add on something on real quick. And I think obviously you guys kind of touched on it a bit, that each institution kind of was able to mask everything that was going on in the background. So obviously US Olympics, Michigan State, it kind of blinds people from actually checking them. So I think that was probably the biggest thing for me in seeing how all this kind of played out.
Yeah, great point. Great point. I wanted to roll into our next topic, which is actually Nestor, since you just I'll roll it into you. And let's touch on your thoughts on the power and abuse component.
Yeah, and I think I just kind of spoke about it, the power and abuse. I think because the system was never checked, or the people who were protecting the system, it was basically protected by the wrong people. So they had a position, nobody ever checked up on them, and it kind of just flowed until something like this happens, and then policies start kind of taking action. But again, I think it has to do with who's in charge, and then how are we checking the people that are in charge for this not to happen again. But no, I think obviously the institutions failed in all ethics, all the responsibilities from coaches, from staff members, from I forget her name, the lady that was told years before, and she never came out. She kind of just ignored it. To the parents, some of the kids were telling the parents, and then the parents kind of ignored it as well. So I think again, the power and abuse that institutions have, I think there has to be policies of how we can check up on these on everybody who's at the top, so things like this don't happen again.
Caleb, you have something to add? Like to add?
Just on that part, I think it's crazy to think that I understand what a lot of the girls were talking about, where they said like, oh, I didn't even, I would never suspect him of ever doing anything. Like he's been my doctor for years and that sort of thing. I thought that was actually pretty powerful because, think about people in your own community. Like stuff like that could happen at any moment. Stuff comes out because incidents happen. And so then you're kind of questioning, well, is this person, I've known this person for years. I never would imagine them doing something like that. And then he comes out and actually there's all these incidents and things that happen and stuff. And it's just kind of like, as a parent on the other side, you're kind of thinking, is anybody safe and stuff? So like that's why it's so hard. Like even people that have like a really powerful reputation, you're like, it could happen just to anybody and stuff. So I thought that seeing all those girls have to go through that and stuff was just really shocking and unfortunate and everything there.
Adam, any thoughts? or anything you'd like to add?
Sure. I mean, I kind of mentioned it a little bit before, but when I was talking about the other things that we already just mentioned, but basically the athletes were trying to make optimum use of like their bodies, and that required the coaches and stuff to exert like abusive control. And because the Carolis got results from this abusive control, it really just allowed Larry Nasser to just continue that in a different way. The athletes were very much coerced into like the desires of being the best, and so that's like allows power to be abused. In the organizational sense, I don't think it really is not great when the organization was so controlled by Steve. I think his name was Steve or Perry, the leader.
Yeah, Penny.
Yeah, Penny. He had so much like ability to control what was going on underneath him that there was not a lot of really safeguards in the organization when there was a problem. All the decisions just like rested on him, and that seems to be like a hierarchical problem within the organization.
Yeah, absolutely, and that kind of ties into the whole, Cunningham organizational and institutional hierarchies, because he kept the lid on it, and it's just shocking to me that that he was able to get the FBI also, that was involved and delay their ability to through, ostensibly promises of jobs or whatever for the lead investigator, and that they kicked it out to a different FBI office to kind of bury the scandal, or at least delay the scandal. And so as we look at this, like in various lenses, how does this impact the stakeholders, this component? Do you have any thoughts? Or, I'm sorry.
Well, it like really impacted them like in a lot of like bad obvious ways. Like some of the gymnast careers were ruined. Some of them, were so disheartened or quit. Some of them, different things like the one gymnast dropped out of when she didn't make the Olympic team. She dropped out and then went to Oklahoma University instead, which was obviously like a better, safer environment. Some of the gymnasts, they just persevered by like terrible abuse. And then it seems like too the only real consequences for the organization, like the coaches, the parolees, were kind of at the end of their career when this like broke, and they just were able to retire. And then Larry Nasser is the one who they kind of he got the actual like jail time. And then there was kind of a puff arrest for Steve Penny, but they never really brought charges. I think in 2022 the charges were dropped.
Right.
So it really seems like it really tarnished, USA gymnastics like reputation in like a terrible way, and not a lot of people had to face much accountability. On like a positive side, I will say that there's like a big group of people who did fight back against this, like the reporters that were breaking the story, like the gymnasts that came out and then came together to kind of like, expose this like abuse. Those are like really positive things about people that believe like that this is wrong, like ethically, they're showing to us that it's wrong. And a weird example from the state of Connecticut where I live is like after this broke, they finally passed the state law that all the state would have to have mandatory training, like in elementary schools and stuff. It's insane that they didn't have that before 2015, but I'm pretty sure this pushed it over the edge, So that's like another positive thing for the stakeholders. It like affected the United States, like all.
Yeah, no, for sure. And that's interesting. Like your state actually was a bit ahead of California. We didn't have to start doing mandatory reporting training until I want to say like 2019. So a couple years later, but I'm sure it was a result of this horrible incident. And Sam, anything you would like to add, possibly?
Yeah, I think just hearing like the reporting side, right, is going through my head was when the students at MSU reported Nassar to Kathy Klages, and then she really didn't do a lot with believing the athlete first, and two, almost from what I could see, was shame the athlete in even thinking that would be Nassar's conduct. I think that, like anyone, it doesn't necessarily, the behaviors shown by Nassar doesn't necessarily mean align with Nassar's conduct generally, but he still breached beyond his general profile with engaging in these behaviors. So I think when you're reporting, or someone's reporting to you as an administrator or a coach or a director or a principal, whoever it is, you know, especially at the ages that these girls were going to in the reports that they were trying to approach the administration on, they're at that age where they've already developed, right? And I would say enough life experience to know what is generally right and wrong in those situations. I don't think they would have the heart to fabricate things at that level of, um, where you can hear some really wild fabricated stories from a 10-year-old in comparison to a 20-year-old young athlete. So for me, I think that was the biggest one. And I'm like, wow, how many times, how many opportunities did Kathy Collegius in this have to see the best in the athlete and actually document and report this? And it was not just one athlete, if I recall, going into her office. It was multiple. And I'm thinking, if there's one more, if you're getting that a volume of that intensity of athletes coming to you about a fellow colleague, an employee you may have known for decades, I seriously would be like, hey, hang on a minute, something isn't right. Just period. So it had the tone of just neglect. It almost, yeah. I just think that there was a lot of almost power imbalance being shifted back onto the athlete and blame culture and gaslighting, and they didn't even realize they were doing it. So you got to take reporting seriously. I know that a lot of us on this call may be involved in club soccer and high school and things like that, but in terms of like nowadays, in terms of reporting and like safeguarding and safe sport and things like all these different organizations, it's going on all the time. Like for my role, I have to do it a lot. So I just wonder if during this time, how many times were these like Clagius, NASA, how many times were they being regulated in a period of time and retrained and recertified? It just didn't seem like they knew how to conduct a safe reporting protocol.
Yeah, personally, I would tend to agree with you that it wasn't really the standard, especially in the 90s. Though I didn't personally coach in the 90s, I did start coaching in the early 2000s, and it was there wasn't that culture, whether it be at the high school level or the club level at that time. Um, and I think the extent that we had to do was um, background check through a thing called LifeScan, which would update the club if you did have something untoward happen, that the club would get an alert saying that, okay, this guy got, a DUI, or, something that might make the individual unsuitable to continue to coach. Or, um, and it's not just, club soccer. My wife gets LifeScan as a nurse. And so for her situation, like if there was anything like drugs and alcohol related, it would make her unqualified to be a nurse, and that she would lose her job over it, type of situation. And so there apparently are different metrics, but I'm kind of getting off topic. So I'm gonna pass the baton at this point to Caleb, just to kind of talk about the reporting mechanisms that we have now versus then, and how they might be used or not used.
Yeah, so just to really quick, I just want to answer something that Adam had spoke about. They did get rid of some of the U.S. gymnastic coaches, I believe, like a bunch of them got fired. I think also some people on the Olympic Committee that didn't follow through with the investigations when they were like initially like filed and stuff. So like there was some of those people didn't just like retire; they did get like removed from their positions and stuff there. But I wanted to add a quick couple of different things here. One thing is an ethical philosophy. I might be not pronouncing this right, but it's deontology, where people have the moral duty to follow rules and respect the right of others, which, with Dr. Nasser and also I think Kathy Clagius is one of the biggest people that did not, complete what they were supposed to, and it ended up with a lot of people getting hurt. One source that I was finding that was a little bit similar with the Olympic Games and stuff there from Mountjoy et al. 2022, only 30% of the athletes weren't aware of what like harassment and abuse meant, and only 26% were not aware of how to even report allegations. So after the scandal had surfaced, there was a new act in place after the ruling on Larry Nasser and stuff. There is Protecting Victims from Sexual Abuse and Safe Sport Authorization Act of 2017. So another source I found, Johnson et al., is the U.S. Center for Safe Sport. It's an independent nonprofit organization which is focused on ending all forms of abuse in sport while carrying out its mission of making nations sports culture through abuse prevention, education, and accountability. So I think because all that stuff came to light, they created a whole organization to try to help better deal with this for athletes, not only Olympic level, but all kinds of levels for players and athletes that are dealing with that kind of stuff. One coaching implication that I can put into this is what I do when I'm walking around my teams. I do a little eavesdropping mostly it's just like normal stuff, what they're talking about, like video games or school or different things. But I now, after watching this documentary, how important that is. It's not to be nosy, but just to know if like something bad is going on, that if there's a way we can help. I found that what I thought might have been just me being nosy or annoying is actually maybe good, because if I notice that the girls are like talking about that kind of stuff, that would be my cue to start like reporting and doing my part and stuff there and investigating those things. Because I'm like, the fact that there were coaches that were walking around and just said, oh, they're just like going to ignore it. I think that was like crazy. I was like, you're hearing it's one thing if it's like one or two girls, but like you're seeing multiple people talk about what's happening and you chose not to take action. I mean, that's just as harmful as what Kathy Clages was doing. Like there were other people that knew what was going on that didn't do anything about it. So
That's a great point that you make. That there was a breakdown of Kathy Collegiate. I mean, think of it. If she had been the first person to to actually follow through instead of trying to suppress the information, there would have been hundreds of young athletes that would not have had to go through that that whole ordeal. So I think that's a really good point. Nestor, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, kind of on the reporting mechanisms. I think back then it was probably a little bit slower, or kind of the system was a little bit more internalized, where people, the higher up, can maybe manipulate it a little bit more. Thus, the abuse continued. Where I think now with Safe Sport, and obviously them trying to improve year and year, so this type of stuff doesn't happen anymore. I think back then, unfortunately, something like this had to happen for action to actually nationwide. So action actually started happening after the fact that this happened. It's kind of unfortunate, but I think now it's a lot easier. I think a lot more coaches are educated, a lot more parents are educated, and athletes are educated as well. But like I said, I think it has to be a constant thing where we keep improving, we keep educating everybody, all the stakeholders. So again, we minimize this, and like I said before, hopefully it doesn't happen again.
Sam, any perspective that you might have?
Sorry, did you say me, Fred?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. I think all the guys touched on it pretty well, right? Like we're talking about, it's all intertwined really when you're talking about reporting, the ethical side, like the culture that was going on and just how much power these people had. It just shows you some of the, I call it like the autonomy and the decision making involved in the process that these decisions were being made or not being made. It just exposed just a very big dysfunction in so many aspects of what we're talking about. Yeah, it was. I think I stated this on the one of our pre sort of presentation questionnaires that we had assigned, and it was, how did you feel about it? And I was just stunned and alarmed at how much it was like a snowball effect.
Yeah.
Of how many things that would trigger off something else, and it trigger off another piece, and I'm like, it was just you just couldn't really understand and comprehend. Like they had so many opportunities to correct so many things.
Yeah, it's just, and to your point, not only was it, I mean, it was multiple organizations, right? You've got, you've got the gyms, you've got the USAG, you have the United States Olympic, Committee, and even at the, I mean, at all these levels, they all wholesale failed. It's, there was one thing that Caleb had touched on, and that was kind of interesting. It was this statistic that he had mentioned of the percentage of people that didn't even realize what was happening to them was like a form of abuse, which is like some of these gals said that, oh, I thought that was just normal. And I'm pulling this little stat from the National Federation of High School course on abuse and bullying, that or harassment and bullying, that I had watched, and it kind of goes along with exactly what Caleb was talking about, that in their survey that they mentioned it within their that little course that I took, that only 9% of the victims of harassment report it. 50% did nothing, which means kind of like 41% seemingly told someone, but it went nowhere. Not that was a direct quote out of that course, but it was kind of like the inferred message. And maybe if you tie that to what Caleb's saying, that a lot of people just didn't realize that, hey, the type of behavior that was going on exhibited by Nassar was abusive, or that the yelling and screaming. There was an example of an athlete that had broke her leg, and she was being screamed at, and she continued to tumble for a year or another month until she couldn't do anymore, and she had multiple fractures in her leg. It just, I mean, all these organizations had just such a seemingly toxic culture. It's just crazy. Anyhow, we're gonna kind of, Nestor, is it something you want to chime in on?
No, no, no.
Okay. So Adam, if we can talk a little bit about the organizational culture, and that piece, that would be amazing.
I kind of touched on this earlier a little bit, but basically the basis of the organizational culture was a culture of abuse, of like abusing the athletes through the system that the Karolis developed while they were in Romania. Basically, like recruiting athletes that were younger, so they were easier to control, and then they were doing all sorts of different kind of like techniques. They were like slapping them. They were like verbally abusing them. Like you just mentioned, like the poor one gymnast who was like still thinking that they needed to continue on like a broken leg. And this creates like a culture of coercion around abuse. And so when you add Larry Nassar to that, it's just another step in like the wrong direction. There's like no, because they decided to focus on winning at all costs, and they had some results at the highest level with this like abusive method. Everyone is just assuming that this is like what you do, and so it created moral disengagement throughout the whole organization. And for example, when people were reporting in like 1997, gymnasts were reporting in 1997 about Larry Nassar, and some of the coaches would just pass it up the chain. And then it took so much longer, like so much more time. It just like created like an insane, like Sam was saying, like a snowball effect of like abuse. It was just kind of under the rug because people were not taking like accountability themselves. They wanted to just kind of be like, well, this is what we do. This is how we do it here. So that they just kind of, permeated like a really bad systemic like issue in USA Gymnastics.
Would anybody else like to chime in or
I'll just say something real quick. So what made it easy was the balance, right? The gymnast coaches that they got overseas were highly decorated. So it was like bad cop, and Larry Nassar was good cop, which is why he was able to get everybody to do basically what he wanted. Like he was off everybody's radar because he was like always the good guy, because he was like giving gifts, which I think is weird. And then like, I mean, obviously we know all the things he did and the conduct was bad, but giving like gifts and stuff, I thought was kind of like a powerful thing, because if he's looked at as the nice guy who gives all these little girls gifts and stuff like that, I'm like, that to me is a flag. But I mean, I don't know for anybody else. It's like, what are these gifts, and what, maybe it's just like candy or whatever. But it's like, when you have that dynamic, that's what made it so good, which is what the film portrayed, was that because he was seen as good cop and making them feel better, anything else he did wrong just didn't seem like it was, like, they just thought it was okay.
Yeah, that's a great point. Absolutely great point. So I'm gonna roll into the last part and then our conclusion. Basically all these organizations fundamentally, and if you look into their bylaws, they had a foundation where they needed to protect the athlete, and they needed to safeguard the athlete. So at their core, they had those kind of built into their mission statements, kind of going back to Mountjoy's Safeguarding Child Athlete in Sport, and recommendations for the IOC. I got this quote: "While it is known that participation in sport has positive health benefits for children, Fraser, Thomas, and Cote recognize that benefits of sport are not automatic, and that the well-being of a person cannot be guaranteed within the sports domain simply by being in their active participation." So it's almost like an admission that, hey, these things can't be done, and which is why they had this recommendation to create, a better structure. And so you have this complete organizational abdication of ethical responsibilities. You had the power and abuse, this inequity of whether it be coach or highly touted doctor abusing their positions towards their to their charges. And then from a stakeholder thing, one of the things that really moved me is that you had two people that committed suicide over this whole incident. You had a parent who was convinced by Larry Nassar that that their child was lying, and then later on, as the child got older and more accounts of abuse came out, the parent realized that they were that they had put their child into a bad position because the child kept on having to interact with Dr. Nassar, and and the parent ended up committing suicide over it. And then the gentleman that owned Twistars, when he got indicted, he committed suicide as well. So you have stakeholders, parents, coaches committing suicide over these actions that they, maybe not so much the parent, but because of the incidents that happen, or they're clinging on to institutional norms or expert authority, and they relied on that instead of maybe relying on listening to their child, which is pretty tragic. So as we bring this together, and kind of in conclusion, I just want to ask each and every one of you, how has this whole topic informed you about maybe what you would do differently as a coach, better as a coach, or if you saw some sort of abuse within an organization that you were involved in, how would you handle that? And I'm going to start with Sam, if that's all right.
Yeah. Well, I think for me, guys, is like, so I coach full time, and it's a very interesting shift. I'll go with, for example, a certain grouping of players as high school girls. As a male coach, you got to watch what you say and how your message lands. But there's a lot of stuff that goes on within high school girls. I coach in an area here in Northern California, in a place called Livermore. And Livermore's a very high-end, expensive place to live. But there's a lot of pressure on high school girls in general in this city. For some reason, it's just the school district, the pressure of how many girls go through different things on just the academic level, but societal pressures and things that they have to navigate. And I remember an incident last spring that I had a high school girls team, and one of the girls, and I'm proud of looking back now and what we're talking about here. And looking back to talking about now, is there was a girl that approached me about one of the high school boys that were training next to us in a team that were talking about her and her physical body, and she wanted me to take her seriously. And I'm like, man, for a high school girl to approach me as a coach, I've got a lot of opportunity to dive in here and take it seriously, or I don't. And I think looking back, I could have really slipped into that place of enabling, just turning a blind eye, but I didn't. And the way it went is she's from Guatemala, and she was talking to me about other layers in her life, about like her school district doesn't take her seriously, and mum's been trying to go through different channels, and the school have been allowing things to happen to her at school. And I was one of the first people to actually take her side and believe in her story. So long story short, my former executive director, who's no longer with my organization, he had to separate boys and girls in terms of literal physical placement of trainings, right, because of this. So I look back and I go, well, that was a win, right? Because we often talk about systemic failures, not looking at how we support our athletes, but that was a win there. And I'm like, man, I got it right. And that was like nearly over a year ago. But there's other instances where I'm like, I could have got that wrong, and I don't know. Maybe I wasn't aware at that point, or I haven't evolved as much as a coach to even take things that seriously, or just even question my own process within what's been communicated to me. So I think for the what is, this enabled a lot of failures to come out, right? I think we all agree with that. And we recognized just how they're interlinked and intertwined, and how we have, as leaders, the opportunity to shape culture in ways that are athlete-centered, regardless of what noise that we have to navigate within that process. So I would say that's on us, and we get to be part of that. And so it's a key piece.
Nestor.
Yeah, no, I think kind of what Sam said. Obviously, I think now your eyes are a little bit more open, and it's not just, for example, my environment. It's the whole staff. It's the front office, and you're just more open. Your eyes are just more open to see what's happening. Even if people are nice, maybe you still have to take in place policies, whatever the fact may be. But I think, yeah, in my environment, obviously now my eyes have been more open since the safe sport trainings, etc. And maybe it's parents, maybe it's coaching staff, and like I said, maybe front office people that might be suffering of something, maybe not sexual abuse, but maybe something else, an abuse of some sort. So again, I think it just always taking a step back and kind of seeing the bigger picture and making sure I carry my ethical responsibility.
Adam, your thoughts?
For me, to continue kind of what Sam and Nestor both said, I think that you'll find that you really have to take like the personal responsibility. I've noticed a kind of a change, and from when I started working in public schools and taking these mandatory trainings, to where they didn't emphasize like personal responsibility as being like a mandatory reporter as much, and now finally it's becoming like you have to. You are required, like by law. They're trying to emphasize so much that you need to take the responsibility to report, because obviously in these organizations, you might find like a lot of pushback from some of the people you work with. So you're going to have to be like strong in believing what you hear and believing the people that report to you and actually like going through with reporting. That's really like my takeaway. It's so easy to become like morally disengaged from the situation and push that like responsibility to like your boss or something, but that's not going to help. You need to do it yourself. So that's really what I'm taking away from this.
That's a great point. And Caleb, bring it on home, my friend.
So I mean, I don't have too much to add, but it kind of gets back to that point I was talking about where you're just kind of in the background sometimes when you're coaching, just listening to the kids to see if things are going on and nipping things in the bud, like as soon as it happens, because like you don't want something to snowball and become something bigger, which is what basically the Kathy Clages and U.S. Olympics gymnastics did, right? So we want to make sure that when things arise, that you're decisive, you make the right decision, and just try to report and do what is right, and that way, you help as many people as possible.
Well, fantastic, gentlemen. I appreciate each and every one of you and your contributions towards this project. We're
And here are our references.